Einfach gelöst, and I'm Urs, your host. Today's guest is one of the forefathers of Agile thought practice. He is a co-author of the Agile Manifesto. He co-founded the Pragmatic Bookshelf Publishing House. He co-authored the Pragmatic Programmer, one of the highly influential books on software development. This is a conversation Mike Cohn said he would love to listen to. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to welcome to the show Mr. Andy Hunt. Andy, would you introduce yourself in your own words?
Hi, well, thanks for having me here. Always appreciate a chance to get out and blather on about my opinions, my history, the looks in my crystal ball, all that sort of thing. You covered the basics of it. I've been a programmer forever, it seems. My first computer predated the IBM PC. I had email before there was an @ sign. Once you start going down that road, it kind of dates you a little bit, but I've been doing this a long time, and I've seen a lot of stuff come and go, and a lot of stuff that's still here that I really wish had gone, but that we're still saddled with. So why don't we dive in? What would you like to talk about?
So you started programming commercially, and then something happened, and you got into this weird thing they called lightweight methods back in the day. So how did you get there? What drove you to it, and what came after?
The reason anyone wants change is because what they have sucks for whatever reason, right? Whether your
Oh,
house is too small or you're not getting along with your spouse or whatever, whatever whatever's not working, it's like, well, we got to change this. And software development at that time could be really painful and slow and expensive and this was, one could argue this has been a problem since, the first transistor kind of thing. This has always been an issue. It was bad enough that, a bunch of people were looking at, well, what can we do? What can we do better? And so I was very much, so this was in the, yeah, I guess it was mid 90s. I teamed up with Dave Thomas on a particular project by then. But I've been working on, putting out white papers and studies and poking around at these issues for a while. And when he and I got together, we had realized we had come to very similar places
hmm.
from different starting points, but we had come to a kind of a common place of, well, we know this sort of technique works and this kind of technique works, and we should do more of this and less of that. So that's when we decided, purely out of laziness sake, to write a big white paper that we could give to our clients that would kind of set them on the right path. Stop doing this. It's stupid. It hurts. It's not going to be effective for you. Try this instead. Think about this way, that sort of thing. And that white paper project grew to become the Pragmatic Programmer. So this was all of our kind of collected wisdom of things that we had actually done in practice and actually worked. And that's one of the struggles, especially at that point. You'd have a lot of people publishing methodology or talking about programmer workflows or whatnot who had never done it, or it worked once for one company, and they're like, oh, okay, this is how it works. This is how you do it now. At least we had the advantage of advocating for techniques and practices and habits and thought processes that we knew to work and work across at least some multiple companies and multiple environments. Over my career, I've worked anywhere from very small startups to Fortune 10, all kinds of different industries, from stock market providers to healthcare to, just boring old business to graphic arts to audio. I mean, kind of all over the place. And, when you see a lot of different environments like that and still see that, hey, this kind of thing works and this kind of thing still doesn't work. That gives you some good insight that, yeah, we might actually know what we're talking about. So we, of course, weren't the only people doing this kind of thing. There were a lot of folks out there trying to figure out how to make writing software not quite so painful and tedious. And I'll say anecdotally, now there was a project I worked on, and it was for a large company, and part of their process was You had to write out detailed design documents on paper before you could write a line of code. You had to map out every function call, every parameter, every data value for the parameter, the expected values, the return value, absolutely everything, pseudocode of what it would do. All this had to be written, approved, documented, filed before you could write a line of code.
I would essentially be done by then, wouldn't I?
Except, as we all know, pseudocode doesn't run.
Yeah, right.
So there's zero feedback from the process. So, you'd spend all ridiculous manner of time cooking up this garbage, and then everyone would approve it and everyone's happy. Oh, it's great. Now it's just typing, right? Well, programming has never been just typing. So, you'd actually then try to put this stuff together, make it work. And then you start having the grand epiphanies of this will never work because we forgot about this piece of data that's got to carry along, or we didn't understand this requirement, or
Yeah.
whatever, the usual litany. And that particular company ended, I left before it blew up, but it was a disaster. I mean, they ended up firing the VP and laying off, I think, tens of thousands of people in that particular incident. It was big. It was a big, hairy deal. History is littered with corpses of companies doing that sort of thing. One of the early consulting gigs that Dave and I took, it was either as we were writing Pragmatic Programmer or shortly thereafter. They called us in and we said, okay, here's what you're doing wrong. Here's the wall you're about to head for. Here's why you're going to smash into that wall and it's going to hurt. You should do these things differently. And they thanked us very much for our time and paid us our consulting fee and didn't change a thing. And about 6 months later, I heard they canceled the project and took a $14 million charge against earnings because their
Gosh.
2 or 3, whatever your project it was, never shipped a line of code. Nothing. And that seems less likely in this day and age. I mean, people will ship stuff. It could be garbage, and it might be some garbage that Claude spat out or ChatGPT or what have you. But at least they shipped something. But back then, and especially around the turn of the century, it was very, I don't know about very common, but it was common enough that you could blow millions, tens of millions of dollars on a project and literally have nothing to ship for because people would get all wound up in trying to complete the design and complete the understanding of the system before building it. And that is a stupid idea. There are a handful of small domains where that actually works. And you actually do need to do it that way. But we're talking about maybe 3 or 4 domains out of 10,000, where
Yeah.
where that actually is probably the right way to go about it. But
Yeah.
that's not common. For the most part, we only learn what a system needs to do by doing it, by having it out there, by getting that feedback. And that was, to me, that was the important sort of insight that we had at the time. It almost doesn't matter what you call it or how you go about it. But at the end of the day, how you get feedback, how fast you get feedback, and how fast you can act on that feedback, that's what it all comes down to, right? So why do we do continuous integration? We do it to get the feedback. Why do we do something like test-driven development? We do it to get the feedback. It's
Yeah.
not it's not for the testing, it's not for this or that or the other stuff. It's to get the feedback and then to be able to act on that feedback and say, "Oh, well, okay, that didn't work. This is horrible. We got to scrap that. We've got to do something different." And unfortunately, of course, in a lot of cultures, a lot of team cultures, you're not allowed to fail in that way. It's like, well, we wrote this, we spent 2 weeks, 6 weeks, a month, a year, whatever, writing this, and that's what it is. We're stuck with it. Like, but it doesn't work. Well,
Right.
okay.
That's
No.
the other day I spoke to Tom Mellor, one of the old Scrum trainers, a friend of Mike Cohn's. He remembered his first Scrum project when he spoke to his boss about it, and he was like, what's the worst thing that could happen? And he said, we might fail. And she said, no, that's not a risk. That's an expectation. So he said, okay, tell me what the risk is. She said, you might actually succeed and we might draw attention. This is something that goes through your body of work. I mean, this whole thing about evidence and feedback, be it on the single line code level or on the methodology level, where you say we need to have it seen in practice for several times.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Because the problem is, and this is, really an endemic problem with software development, is it's all in our head. It's really easy to envision what a system will look like, what a piece of code would look like, what an individual function or module or procedure would look like. But then to actually execute on that and make it work and make it robust and make it reliable and make it secure in this day and age, that's a whole different kettle of fish. It's easy to get excited. You've got that, that upfront excitement, and that vision is really easy. And this makes it hard for stakeholders and folks who aren't programmers and don't know how it works. They're like, well, I just want it to do this, or I want it to look like this other app. Just do it. How hard can it be? Right? Because if you're not in the industry, you have no idea. And it seems easy. I mean, geez, I can just talk to one of these generative LLMs and it spits code at me all day long. How hard could this possibly be?
Yeah.
But it is hard. And we'll talk, I'll rant on AI a little bit later, but I want to get
please.
back for a second. Because you mentioned Scrum, and we were talking a bit about the early days.
Right.
When the get together happened. So Dave and I had written the Pragmatic Programmer, and we're flogging that, and it had our take on what a kind of a lightweight approach would be. We very much like the idea, what we call tracer bullet development, where it's a military analogy. If you want to see where you're aiming, you put a phosphorus bullet, like every, whatever it is, every 10, every 15, every 20, something in the magazine. But while you're shooting, you get these tracer rays, so you get live real-time feedback of where the ammo's landing. Mm-hmm. As opposed to like cranking up the big gun, taking a bunch of measurements, figuring for the wind, shooting, and by the time you've done that, unless you're shooting at a city, the thing has moved by now and you've missed your target. So we thought this was a really good metaphor. You can take your time and measure everything, but the target's moved. Or you can get something that offers you real-time feedback. You're shooting, you see the lights, the target's moved, you adjust. And to do that in code, the way to do a real tracer bullet is picture you're going to write the entire app in an afternoon, and you're going to represent every major layer, every major portion of it. But each piece you write is hello world. It's one line. Mm-hmm. It returns dummy stub data. It doesn't really work. But it's not really a prototype either. It's more of a, folks used to call us a walking skeleton, or something like that, right? But you start super, super stupid thin, but now all the parts talk to each other. And so many projects, especially if they divvy it up, well, you guys do this end and you guys do this part, you guys do that. And then you try to hook it together. Suddenly there's education involved. It's like, oops, that didn't work, did it? And this won't fit. And, you get all these disastrous project outcomes when you try to like assemble stuff later and haven't had that kind of integrations. This was the kind of thing we were talking about and thinking, and everyone else had their bits of business. Alistair had a really great book on object-oriented development and project management in that kind of environment, and the Crystal Method. And Highsmith had his book out that was really good. Kent Beck had, of course, put out the seminal book on extreme programming, with a subtitle. I still love the subtitle. The subtitle is Embrace Change. Which I'll get to that in a second. So here we are. So it's 2001, and a vaguely random assortment of interested folks who had the time and were available at the time got together at Snowbird to discuss these sorts of topics. People have asked me numerous times since then, what did you think was going to happen? And I have a couple answers to that. So first of all, it was not uncommon in that day and age for a bunch of folks to get together and have kind of a mini conference it wasn't super common, but it was something you might do a couple times a year. And so this particular one, it's like, okay, well, this sounds interesting. I didn't know a lot of the folks at that. I hadn't met Kent at that point, or Ward, or any of the other folks. Um, but we all met there, and realized what we had in common, and where we didn't, and thrashed it out. And what was interesting, I think, in hindsight, was when we came out of there, there were a couple things we thought were going to happen. First of all, we figured everyone and their dog would come out with their own agile method, branded for their company, their consulting firm, their whatever. They would kind of hopefully stick to what we'd outlined in the manifesto, and the points behind it. But they would name it themselves, and they would tweak it and refine it. And the most important line of the manifesto still is the very first one, where it says, we are uncovering different ways of doing stuff. We're searching, we're seeking, we're learning. We didn't arrive on the mountain and say, yay, verily, here are the tablets, do it this way. We know, we got the answers, baby. No, we didn't, right? We were looking then, and we're looking now. We're not looking as hard, unfortunately, but that's a separate problem. Anyhow, so we thought that this would be a very common thing, that everyone would kind of roll their own based on these ideas. What we were afraid of, which is really funny, and we were afraid that it was almost irrelevant to even have that meeting or even promote other methods, because we had extreme programming. And we thought that XP so well embodied what you would want in an agile method that it would rule the world. And that all these other players, including Scrum, including, DSDM, Crystal methods, Highsmith's work, all these various bits, we didn't think any of them would get a fair shot at the light of day, because XP would just drown out the conversation.
That's really
And
interesting, because
just
in the end, extreme programming proved much too extreme for general corporate adaptation, whereas Scrum essentially was a safe of its day, which was much easier to sell.
It was easier to sell, and that is really unfortunate, because what folks didn't understand at the time, and I unfortunately still don't understand to this day, is Scrum is a project management process methodology. It's not a development process. And Ken Schwaber and
Jeff.
God, my brain, Jeff Sutherland, they've gone on record saying in no uncertain terms and loudly, you can't do Scrum by itself. You have to have technical practices. You need something like XP. And while you're at it, just do XP. That would save you a lot of heartache. But that message got lost. And then, to make matters worse, I hazard a cynical guess that probably 80% of the companies that claim to be doing Scrum are doing no such thing. They're having a stand-up meeting, and they're filling out Jira tickets, and a lot of folks think they're doing Scrum, aren't doing it well. And even if they did, if that's all they did, it's of marginal utility. It's not that helpful. At best, Scrum is kind of training wheels, because what Scrum is fundamentally to me is it's a mini waterfall. It takes waterfall and condenses it down to 2 weeks. Now, for the time, so we're talking early aughts, late 90s, that was tremendous. Having training wheels, having a scaled down waterfall, so you didn't waste 2 years and tens of millions of dollars and piss off and never have a line of code to ship. Now, at least you had this constrained down to like a 2 week window, and you would ship something. At least you'd get something out the door, mostly. So that was great. And I don't mean to dump on Scrum, because it served a very valuable purpose then. The problem was it was misunderstood and then misapplied by so many, that now you say something about Agile and people don't hear Agile, they hear Scrum.
Yeah.
because to them, Scrum is agile. There is no agile that is not Scrum. Everything is Scrum. Scrum all the things. That's just this sort of where they're at, and that's just so unfortunate because that really kind of closed off the conversation that we still need to have, because Scrum doesn't address a lot of the important things on either side of the fence, right? So it doesn't talk about technical practices that you need, things like TDD, or tracer bullet development or continuous integration, or, any of these sorts of stuff. And from the project management standpoint, it doesn't really address what we need in the team culture for skill development, for shared learning with the user or stakeholder community, being able to refine your own practice from what you're doing, which is really important. It doesn't get into any of the high level stuff at all. Like we now know since then from various studies and approaches about the importance of psychological safety and psychological support on the team, about aligning corporate reward structures and motivations and incentives with what you want to see. So, right, this kind of kills me. It's like, CEOs will be like, "Oh, we respect the team. It's all about teamwork," and then you only get a raise for things that have nothing to do with the team.
Yeah, right.
And don't support that sort of activity, or even hostily antagonistic towards it. It's like, well, to get my bonus, I have to do this, which it will screw my team over or screw the project over, but that's how the company is set up. So there's all kinds of important issues at both higher and lower levels of abstraction that aren't addressed. Even with the Scrum and XP stack, there's still things that you're missing. So one thing that I had started doing back a couple of years ago, probably around 2016 or so, was accumulating better practices and habits. I started calling them habits instead of practices because, again, with XP and with Scrum, I think the notion of a development practice started to get misunderstood and misapplied and feared, maybe. Um, I've had a couple of speaking engagements where people said, "Well, we love your message. We love the notion of continuous feedback and all these other topics that you talk about, but don't use the word agile because we tried agile once and we almost died
Yeah.
and no one wants to talk about it again."
It's burned
And
out in a sense.
it's burned out, right? And
Right.
of course, you go to talk to, well, what did you try? What did you do? And what they tried, they'd never read the manifesto. They'd never read Kent Beck's book or any of the other authors' books on agile thought. They
Yeah.
did some horrific, torturous version of Scrum that looked like it would have come out of some deep bureaucracy from some government with all kinds of ceremony and steps and pieces. And it's like, well, of course it sucked. Of course that
Yeah.
didn't work
Yeah,
because
right.
what you were doing was not agile in the least.
There's this very interesting point that Mike Cohn made the other day that Scrum is a very bare bones framework because it's meant to evolve into whatever you need. So you get kind of the Kanban Scrum or the DSDM Scrum or whatever, depending on your organization, depending on your product. And this is what's missing today, I guess, because people just want the one true Scrum, and whatever looks outwardly like Scrum is good enough because it fits their management methodology at the time. And then there's no change at all. As you said, in a way we stopped improving, which is you mentioned embrace change. There's the thought like we need to change once and then it's done. Whereas actually when we start doing agile, the last change lasts forever. We keep on changing.
That's a very, very important point. And you're exactly right. Every CEO, every corporation, every board wants the one true answer, whatever it is. They want certainty. And that's a basic human cognition. It's a basic cognitive fallacy. It's like you want certainty. It doesn't matter if it's wrong. I just want it to be known. And this, parenthetically, this is I think why generative LLMs are so successful because it will absolutely give you an answer anytime, right now. No hemming, no hawing. You know what the consultant's favorite word is?
Depends.
It depends, right? You ask a very simple, straightforward question, right? And what answer do you get? The more skilled they are, especially, you get, well, it depends. Because it does. The context is very important. What works well for this company in that context probably won't work for you or yours, right? A lot of folks look to, big players like Netflix.
Mhm.
Or Amazon, right? It's like, oh, we want to do the same process that Netflix does. We want to have the same scalability that Netflix does, and they go through all this rigmarole, and then you find out they have 14 customers. I appreciate the sentiment here, but you're in a completely different context. You have a
Mhm.
small number of large clients. Each one's sort of homogeneous, but you have a small number of clients. You don't have the scalability issues that Netflix has delivering content. Your feature set has nothing to do with that. Your delivery mechanism has nothing to do with them. Why are you looking to them for process? you
Mhm.
know um and that kind of thing just goes all the time, because again, we've got this underlying human nature of we want the answer even if it's wrong. We just want the one true way. We'll do that because now I can't be fired for making a choice because I was just following the process. So, willing to kind of give up some agency for the security of, well, it's not our fault. We did it the right way. Um, but there is no right way. There's
Yeah.
certainly no one right way. There's a small number of good ways that we know to build software that 80% of the programming shops out there refuse to do. This isn't even just about Agile or about Scrum or about XP, but in general, if you go back and look in especially the early days of say early 70s, you look at papers,
Mhm.
Turing Award lectures. You look at papers from that period, and you go back and read Fred Brooks and
Mhm.
Dijkstra and folks like this, and you realize the level of thought to the sort of larger scale issues of what does it mean to write code? How do we best express ourselves? What kind of compiler or interpreter would be best at this? It was a lot more experimenting, a lot more thinking about stuff like that. I mean, there's some great stuff in those old papers,
Right.
and they point out a lot of errors and say, oh, by the way, we've discovered this doesn't work. And guess what we've been doing for the last 50 years is exactly that. We keep doing the things that has been known not to work, but our our educational pipeline is so broken that the message doesn't get through.
I mean, Dijkstra famously noted in one of his final papers that computing in general failed. I think he said its central challenge being to clear things up or not to make a mess of things or something like that.
Yeah, we didn't get that. We kind of screwed up that. You would think most professions would do better at learning from mistakes of the previous project or the previous generation of projects or the early days or whatever.
Right.
But we have this sort of amnesia where it's like any brand new project, it's like we've never seen the planet before. It's like we're starting from scratch, and we refuse to read the old papers. We refuse
Yeah.
to know what they did 2 projects ago because this is the brand new kind of widget. Everything's different now.
Yeah.
Well,
Why do you think
well,
that is?
I think it's a mix of things. So part of the problem is technology does change all the time and
Mhm.
rapidly. So people used to ask me, well, what programming language should I study in school? It's like, who cares? Because whatever it is, that's not what you're going to use once you get out in the real world. In fact, your entire job, once you get out in the real world, probably doesn't exist yet if you're in college. It's something that's going to be invented as you hit the workplace. And that's still true, I think. You've got this, really rapid march of technology, and I think we fall into the trap of thinking that, oh, well, everything's different now.
Mhm.
There's LLMs on the landscape, so things are completely different than they were in Brooks's day. The technology might be different. And I'll argue on that point because, again, if you go back and look at a lot of the papers, especially from the Lispers back in the day,
Mhm.
there probably hasn't been an actual original thought in computer science since about maybe 1967. We've gotten faster at it, we've gotten better, but the fundamentals, it's kind of all the same. But putting that aside, let's take the claim that yes, technology marches forward. It's always brand new. There's always it's a new language, it's a new JavaScript framework. God help us, it's a new methodology, whatever.
Oh,
We haven't changed.
uh-huh.
We're the same. That gunky wetware between our ears, that's the same crappy CPU it's been for 4 million years. Or so that's the actual problem. It's like we haven't changed. We're the same people that existed in Fred Brooks's day. We're the same people that existed when Dijkstra was writing. We're the same
Hmm.
people when RUP was invented, the same people when Agile was invented, the same people when LLMs came out. We're still us. We human beings are not computers. That would seem an obvious statement, but it's not because I think we would like them to be. We would like to say, all right, here's a team. We're just going to give them the process. We'll give them the instructions, and then we can treat it like a kid's Play-Doh machine. You stick the clay in at top, and you turn the crank, and it extrudes and makes these little shapes that pops out.
The software factory.
The software factory. That has
Yeah.
always been the dream
Yeah.
of the business owner is, I know what I want. Just make it happen. Again, why is this so hard? Well, it is hard because what we loosely call software development is actually this incredibly complex in terms of complexity theory complex sort of nexus of technological, sociological, legal, humanitarian concerns meeting in this ill-defined, fuzzy kind of place. And again, we're new at this. We've only been doing this. What do you want to take? What do you want to take as the starting date of computing? Late 40s maybe. Not a lot of. We haven't even cracked a century yet. In a lot of ways, we don't make it better with each generation. In some ways, we make it worse. Because we kind of chase the wrong things. We'd mentioned going into this, it's like,
Yeah.
feedback being so important. Okay. Well, what have we done to improve feedback to developers? And we have done some things. We have done some things. I mean, I'll say, having an IDE that does autocomplete and looks up things and helps you see what parameters are needed for what library. Sure, that's a good assistive kind of technology. That's great.
Yeah.
We've certainly gotten better at building infrastructure for continuous integration and continuous development.
Gotten
Don't,
better at project setup. I mean, look at what you did with Ruby back in the day, 2000, or when did your book come out? And now we
yeah,
have David Heinemeier Hansen building on that with Ruby on Rails. That's an advantage.
that was a definite advantage. We will keep seeing stuff like that. People will come up with things because again, I think when he first wrote Ruby on Rails, it was to solve a very particular problem.
Building Basecamp.
It's like, yeah, exactly. And that's where the best stuff comes from. It's like, actual use, with actual people because you're getting the feedback on it. I mean,
Right.
that is absolutely the secret ingredient. And you can see that. So if you look at what Lean preaches, right? One of the big things from Lean that I think everyone needs to understand is that every time you have a process gate, a handoff, a check, right?
Mhm.
Lean people call that waste.
Mhm.
They call that waste, and they call that waste rightfully so, because you are artificially creating a bottleneck in your process. And maybe you've got a good reason to do it. Maybe there's regulatory concerns that you have to meet. And okay, fine. If that's the case and you have to do it, do it. That's required in your context, in your environment. But the rest of us, that's not required. So, case in point, look at pull requests, right? Very popular way of doing development. It's the stupidest thing.
Yeah.
And and we know it's stupid. And does that stop people? Does that stop its widespread adoption? It does not.
No, it's code review 2.0. I mean, why don't we all just build on trunk? It's not
Yeah.
that hard,
Yeah.
and we can still branch earlier. We can still roll back. That's all there. You just need to commit and integrate often enough, and then it's all present for everybody. But
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah,
But
somehow
people
in
don't do that.
2010, yeah, somehow in 2010, I don't know who came up with the thing he called the Git workflow
Yeah.
and the branch-based development, and people just flocked to it because it was.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I didn't get it back then when I was still coding, and I don't get it now. But luckily, people are coming to see the light and go more for trunk in these days, as far as I know.
And they should, because again, this is one of those things where we actually we've got numbers, we've got studies,
Yeah,
there's things that say yes. And if you look going back to, oh, probably at least, I don't know, 2015, 2017, somewhere in there, Martin Fowler had a good piece on, okay, you guys use these words, if you say continuous integration, that means you need to check into trunk. That means that
right.
checking in needs to kick off the full build and the full unit test run. If it breaks, it doesn't take you down for a week. It's like, oh, okay, that was this. You fix it. 10 minutes later, you're back on the road and you go.
Right.
That's the environment that continuous integration should really be. And still, in this day and age, I will have people tell me with a straight face that they do their continuous integration on Fridays.
Oh, that's maybe not smart or leads to long Fridays.
Or
But still,
Mondays or whatever.
or,
But
or so, yeah.
that whole continuous part kind of,
Yeah. But
escapes notice there.
no, we might say, okay, let's drop the handoffs. Let's everybody work on trunk. And at some point, we get into some sort of practice of process that would be too hard to do for a junior team. Now, you're very well known for calling for skill appropriate approaches. What's your take on that? So what would be a basic level approach, what Alistair Coburn would call the shoe level, and what would be the more advanced approaches here?
So you hit on a interesting and more fundamental problem is, yes, you have higher skilled people, you have lower skilled people. You may have fully higher skilled teams, you may have fully junior teams. You probably have a mix
Hmm.
going around. And a mix is probably the best, because this is where another practice that folks seem loath to do, but it's very valuable, is pair programming, or even now ensemble programming. All right.
Yeah.
And there's a certain allergy to that out there in the world. Folks aren't into it. But if you do even some of that, what a great way to bring the juniors along.
Hmm.
Have a junior, just a couple, even, just a little bit of exposure watching a senior programmer in the same environment, from something as simple as not knowing that short key, or I didn't know that part of the system existed, or I didn't
Oh.
know that you could do this, or whatever it is. Because you know a tremendous amount of what we know is tacit knowledge, and
Hmm.
if we get a chance to teach it and explain it, that's great. A lot of times we don't have that opportunity. Few companies, and probably none these days, have any kind of formal mentoring going on. They don't have a pipeline for juniors to sort of work their way into the organization and gain skill. The attitude towards learning is not what it needs to be. Someone asked me many years ago, like 20, 30 years ago, what the most important parts of the programming job were. And I stand by my answer. I say, programming is about two things: communication and learning. That's our skill set, because we communicate to everything. We're communicating to the bare metal, to the compiler, to the interpreter, to the machine. We're communicating to our team members. We're communicating to the end users or the stakeholders, the product owner. God help us if you saddled with such a thing. Well, whoever it is, right? We're communicating on all these fronts and trying to synthesize that. And we're learning from this all the time. We're learning how the system is evolving, and we're learning about our team members and how we interact. We're learning about the user's actual needs, not whatever that crap was they said they wanted, or put in some kind of bogus requirements document. It's like, okay, well, you said that, but from watching you now, I see what you really meant. So it's this continual learning and understanding. And given that those are two sort of the most important things, there's almost nothing in our methodologies or in our teaching and training that recognizes any of that. We expect a programmer to show up with full knowledge of the tech stack, even if it was, you know, even if that JavaScript framework came out yesterday. And that's always been the joke, right? Anytime some new tech comes out and the HR people are like, well, we want 5 years experience in this 18-month-old technology.
Right.
I had a client, this was back, mid 2000s, maybe. I was doing some work for him, and we were discussing this idea of improving the skills of their developers, getting better at TDD and unit testing in general, and better architectural decisions. And he told me this was a VP at this large company. He said, "Oh, we don't want to train our employees. If they got smart, they'd leave." And he was 100% serious. And
And
I've heard similar statements from other folks
and
before and since, but this was the most ball-faced, straight up, no, if they learn too much and get smart, they won't want to work here. So my first question is like, what does that say about the people you have left? And
yeah,
this is what kills me.
yeah,
It makes me think that I really wasted. I mean, when I went to college, I got a degree in computer and information science. That was what
mm,
my bachelor was in. And I have long said that it was a bit of a waste because all the technology I learned in college was almost immediately useless, right? For networking, we learned oh God, I've forgotten the name of it now. It was the other stack that wasn't the TCP stack. It was the
oh,
uh, OSI. It was the OSI stack. And for languages, one of the big languages we used in college was Modulo 2, very
yeah,
commercially popular.
yeah.
So it goes back to the what you learn in college,
Yeah,
you'll never
but
use.
still,
But
what you learn is structured thought. What you learn is how networking protocols work in general. So it's
yeah,
not a waste of time,
yeah.
I think.
Well, it's the structured thought is the key thing, and
Yeah,
that's a lot of universities for comp sci degrees really want to see high standardized testing on math abilities, and that's always struck me as backwards because what you really want is someone with good language skills. You want a high, in our case, the English SAT. You want someone who can write an essay, who can formulate thoughts and guide thoughts, right? That's, the only part of math that gets close to that is maybe, proofs and inductions and theorems and that sort of.
yeah,
But calculus, I took years and years of calculus, and the amount of that I've ever used on a commercial software project is vanishingly small.
that's right.
But trying to trying to do good, excellent written communications or even oral communications, that's 90% of the job. But that's not necessarily how we teach it either. And then you look at the sort of general corporate dysfunctions, which are how much time we got? Not nearly enough.
Right.
So here we come in saying, okay, well, yes, you can have a very agile software development organization. And by agile in this case, I mean able to respond to change. I don't care if you do Scrum or XP or something you rolled your own, but it comes down to it doesn't matter if you followed the process. What matters is when a huge unexpected change slaps you upside the head, you don't panic and are like, okay, we can address that, and you address it and you move on with your life. It's not a catastrophe.
Yeah, being
Um,
resilient, or maybe even as
yeah,
Taleb called it, anti-fragile.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That's the real key, and it doesn't matter how you get there. And unfortunately,
yeah,
as soon as you establish or formulate any process or method, you're going to get people who conflate adherence to the method with project success. I actually did run into an XP shop years and years ago where they embraced it so fervently and so hard. They literally did like story cards to figure out what they wanted to get the group for lunch. I mean, right, a little obsessive. And
yeah,
and they ultimately they weren't successful either. They failed for the other reason because again, they were like, more concerned with the artifacts and the process than the actual work. And getting back to what you said before, I think that's our fundamental problem is we'll do anything to avoid thinking and we'll do anything to avoid having to change our minds.
mhm,
Um, but in a rapidly changing world, you don't have that luxury. We got this great process. It worked fantastic on our last project. You might never get that chance again because the next project's different. Even if it's the same people, they've learned more now. The world has moved on. There's a lot of things happening, at least politically in the world and even technologically, that if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I said, "Oh no, that's stupid. That's never going to happen. We'll never
no,
allow that to happen." Well, here we are. There's a lot more in the I would have said that was impossible pile. That's,
Not on my bingo card.
no, it was not on my, there's an awful lot was not on my bingo card. So, but that's, and one way to think of that is, appalling as that is, the current rate of change that we're seeing in technology and society and government and whatever, the current rate of change is the slowest it's going to be in your lifetime. It is monotonically increasing. That means it doesn't backslide. The rate of change is just going to get faster and faster still as we go on. It certainly has, and unless we do something really disastrous and we're left banging rocks by the river, and we lose the entire tech infrastructure, which again, that was never on my bingo card, but
Well,
things happen,
there's
you know.
there's one man who prepared us for that. That's Don Knuth, who famously put all his code in a book.
Yeah,
And then we,
yeah, exactly. You can't be too careful.
yeah,
But yeah, it's and this is again why things like XP famously said that big design up front was a bad idea.
yeah.
And it was a bad idea. And it remains, 99.9% of the time it remains a bad idea. But that doesn't stop people from wanting to do it because there's comfort in it. And if it's the wrong answer, but damn it, we have an answer.
Looking at all that, I mean, the state of the industry, you're obviously not happy, despite of Agile having become mainstream, but it's not the Agile you had hoped for.
They
How do we
missed
get
the
out of
important
this
point.
mess?
That's an excellent question. And if I had an answer to that, I'd be rich and sitting in Tahiti right now. So wise people have said the only way out is through. I don't know what that means, but it sounds nice. No, it's bad because I mean programming. I keep thinking, oh God, this couldn't get any worse. I had a post the other day. I'd been doing some recreational JavaScript programming, which I said is equivalent to saying I'm doing some recreational smashing my knee with a hammer. Because that's what it feels like, right? The environment is dreadful. It is atrocious. The 20-year-old me, 30-year-old me would have looked at this and said, that's the future? Are you kidding me? That sucks. What is wrong with you people? That's what it is. So the future. All right, what do we got? Well, we got an awful lot of code being generated by generative LLMs. I refuse to call them AI because it's not. It has nothing to do with AI. It is autocomplete writ large. Large to the point where you can burn half the Amazon getting a cute picture of a cat, kind of deal. Okay, fine. So we got these things spewing out code. Well, what does that mean? That means we've got automated technical debt. We've got this huge, powerful factory that can slam out technical debt faster than we can even comprehend it. That's an interesting thought. So maintenance will become literally impossible, I think, just from scale. So what happens then? Well, we'll just get AI to fix it. So where does that end up? I don't know. I mean, the essential problem is that it's not AI. If it actually was AI, it'd be fine. But
Yeah.
there's no validation phase. There's no verification. There's what is a statistically likely sequence of tokens that would follow this. And it is by design going to hallucinate. It's going to make up stuff that isn't right. There was an article today that was it Food and I think it was Food and Drug in the U.S. was adopting I think it was ChatGPT to issue nutrition advice, and apparently one of the things it said was how to use vegetables. The primary thing in the article was here's how to use vegetables as rectal suppositories.
I read about that. Yeah, that was wild.
That was wild.
Yeah.
And sure, you see some big examples of this where it's an obvious fail and it's a clear fail. And if you know the subject area and an LLM spits something out and it's garbage, it's easy to trivially dismiss and say, oh, this is garbage. If you're a junior programmer, if you're a noob, you don't know.
Right.
You don't have that. The senior guy can look at it, senior gal can look at it and be like, no, that's garbage. We know better. If you're junior, you don't know. If I use it in an area I'm not familiar with, gardening maybe or something, I don't know what parts of it to trust and what not. And I don't see any tech yet on the horizon that's going to fix that. So we have an inherently unreliable generator of code that we are embracing with both hands.
You know what's difficult? Coming back to your thought of communicating and learning, this thing makes both break down because we stop communicating to each other and
Yep.
instead communicate with the language model. And well, we can get us to a certain level of learning because maybe the random statistical output is right on point and I get to see some things, but I can't get smarter than that. So I can't get to the senior level. I only can get
Yep.
to advanced intermediate or something. So
Yep.
where do future seniors come from?
Yeah, exactly. There was and somebody had I meant to keep the reference, but somebody had a white paper the other day where they deconstructed and mathematically showed that an LLM can never progress beyond a certain level of expertise. And it
Mhm.
was pretty low. It was like, I'll say beginner, advanced beginner level, right? It was pretty low because, and mathematically, it's like this is all you got with this current technology. Now, will we cook up something better than an LLM at some point? I hope so. I'd like to think so. I don't research in that area, so I don't know what they're working on or cooking up, but maybe this is the baby steps and it leads us to coming into something that's has higher utility for us. Because right now, yeah, as you say, it's doing more harm than good. It's ecologically disastrous for the amount of energy
So
required
much so. Yeah.
to be able to run it. It's disastrous in a humanitarian sense in terms of communication, in terms of culture and learning and continuous improvement. It's not good for that. It's not reliable on its outputs straight out of the gate. That's a lot. That's some pretty significant negatives. And if you look at, extended damage, like, okay, what if this, widespread corporate adoption of LLMs destroys any pipeline of junior to senior programmer?
Mhm.
And this has been issues in other for other reasons in other industries, but like as the post office stopped handling so much mail, they stopped running as many milk runs on the small planes, and now you've got fewer pilots, fewer senior pilots able to work for commercial airlines because they didn't have that opportunity their hours on these low end milk runs as part of their career growth, right? Just because of changing technology, that wasn't a thing anymore. But now, as an unexpected outcome, now it's harder to find experienced pilots because they didn't have
Mhm.
that opportunity.
Right.
So I can absolutely see something like that happening if it hasn't happened already, as the initial old guard gets old, ages out, retires, moves into farming llamas instead of coding, whatever. My generation, I think, was particularly fortunate because when we started, you needed to know how transistors worked. You needed to know gates. You needed to know assembly language. You needed to know these things that you haven't needed to know for a long time now.
Mhm.
And certainly, college freshmen now don't know. They're lucky to get one programming language under their belt, at college. And folks will introduce themselves. I'm a Java programmer. I'm a Ruby
Yeah.
programmer. I'm a whatever. And it's like, no, that's like saying I'm a hammer user. No, you're a carpenter. It's just a tool. But yeah,
Right.
it's like, oh, I'm a 16-ounce hammer user. It's like, well, okay, good for you. These are screws. That's not going to be useful. It's not about that. And it's
Mhm.
not even really about coding. Um, you notice what I said, what's the most important part about programming? I didn't mention coding. It's like, well, sure, that's part of it. You need to know the programming language, you need to know the frameworks and the
Yeah.
languages and the libraries and whatnot, but that's not even the hard part.
Yeah.
That's not most of it, and that's not the hard part. So we get solutions like the generative LLMs that will spit out code. Well, that's nice. That's not even the hard part of the job.
Well, John Kern observed that there's nothing about technology in the manifesto because you just took that as a given. You had to
Yeah.
be at a certain technological level and you had to be at a certain architectural level to just get going where you guys were coming from.
And
So,
and I think that was one of our mistakes. I don't think we appreciated as much at the time, and I think there was maybe some lip service given to it, but the fact that to do the sorts of practices that we were talking about in Agile and even in XP, you need to be a fairly advanced practitioner. If you're brand new to this, that's probably not going to work well for you. The XP, everything could possibly break. I'm going to write
Right.
tests for accessors. I'm going to write tests for anything stupid because I have no idea. I have no
Yeah.
experience at that point, right?
Yeah.
So yes, there is a fair bit of this that expects a level of competence and experience that you know what you're doing, and this is just guidance to help you do the right thing more consistently and faster and better. But if you don't have that experience, that's a bit of a problem. And that's where I think we kind of dropped the ball a bit is we didn't provide any kind of good instructions for any organization of here's how to bring along new hires and juniors and get some knowledge transfer from seniors and make that actually work. We didn't address that. Um, we didn't necessarily address agile adoption as well as we could have. I think in our youthful naivete, we were like, well, here's some really good answers or some really good thoughts, take it and run with it.
Yeah.
Right.
And well, you were all consultants back in the day, so probably there was a consulting gig to be had.
Sure, absolutely. But even so, I think we we might have done a better job at positioning it and setting expectations that this is work.
Yeah.
It's not a one size fits all solution. It's not a it's not a method or process in that kind of concrete sense. It's a mindset. As soon as you go to any board, any CEO, and you start telling them, well, this is a mindset, and they're like, okay, the door's right over there,
Eyes
son.
glazed. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't want to hear that.
Right.
Because again, they want that comfort, they want that reliability, but it's an illusion. So you get something like Safe, which sells you comfort and reliability, and it's all known, and just do this and you're fine. And it's a disaster. I have known more people who've been burned so hard by failed Safe adoptions.
Yeah.
I've got a couple friends where their entire consulting gig is going out and fixing companies that have shot their foot off. I personally don't know of a single success case. I'm sure there's got to be one out there. I'm sure there's some documented ones, but
Yeah.
they're not common. And if you look at why that is, you look at what SAFE prescribes and what they say, and it's very regimented. It's very concrete. It's very, I
Simple,
guess kind
clear
of
solutions, what people ask for.
right, which don't work.
Right. All right. Not to bash on Safe and not to bash on managers. Um, so we've looked at the past, we've looked at the present, we've looked at the future. Annie, is there anything you would want our listeners to look at or to know about? I know you're doing music, I know you're writing books. Anything you want to promote, you want to push out there?
Less so these days. I'm pretty happy. Sure, go buy some of my books. If you haven't read The Pragmatic Programmer yet, if you're one of the 6 people on the planet who has not read it yet, do yourself a favor. Just go read it. And honestly, even if you have to go pirate it, I mean, I'd rather you didn't. I still have I need money in my retirement. Please go buy a copy of the book. But if you can't for whatever reason, at least go pirate it. But somehow read it, go through, understand it. You got any questions, ask around. People like to talk about it. That's always fun. If you like science fiction or thrillers, I've got some novels out there. I've got a book called Weatherly Hall, which is set after the second U.S. Civil War. I wrote this some years ago, I gotta say, but it's set in a haunted house after a civil war in the U.S. So this poor guy is chasing down the haunted house, and he's got drones and a surveillance state, sort of after him. If you like, techno psychological thrillers, that's a fun romp. But I still do some guidance for companies out there for this kind of thing, especially, well, only if they're actually interested in increasing their skills, not getting training, but actually increasing their skills, their ability to learn. We have the Gross Institute is still functional, but it's kind of invitation only at this point. So if that's something that someone's really interested in, just get a hold of me. I'm easy to find. If you Google Andy Hunt, I pop up all over the place, finding email. but get in touch with me and we can help you out. But it's not, I don't offer it to just anyone.
Great, Andy. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Very reflective conversation. I like that very much. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.